next speaker is Chandamal Nicholas. Chandamal practices in all areas of intellectual property law. He has an emphasis on resolving and litigating pharmaceutical patent disputes. Chandamal also advises clients on product regulation matters and compliance in relation to the Food and Drugs Act, patented medicines notice of compliance regulations, and related matters in the agri-food industry, as well as due diligence relating to technology and biotechnology deals with a specific focus on IP and his topic tonight, regulatory issues. Prior to joining Bennett Jones, Chandamal practiced at another full-service firm, not nearly as good, and also an intellectual property boutique focusing on pharmaceutical patent litigation, trademark litigation, and trademark prosecution. Chandamal.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening. I'm going to talk to you about regulatory issues that some businesses face. And when I say regulatory, I mean government-regulated industries. Now, government regulations is usually industry-specific, but in my practice, I've seen questions and issues that arise that seem to transcend different industries, and I wanted to talk to you about those today and just make you aware of them. Now, some of the industries I've worked with, as Chris had mentioned, pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, medical devices, pesticides. And in each of those industries, they've come to us with regulatory issues, usually in the context of an acquisition deal. And questions seem to arise. One question is, do any regulations apply to us? Do we have to meet any standards or meet any obligations? What are those obligations? And so we advise clients on those and try and identify other issues that they may try to face or may need to face. So, do regulations apply to me? Now, if a government wants to regulate a particular industry, they usually create a law, form of an act, and it tells you what you can and can't do. Then they create regulations which explain how you comply with the act. And a good example of that comes from the Food and Drug world, where the Food and Drugs Act says you can't sell a pharmaceutical product unless you have approval and meet certain standards and meet the standards to sell the product in Canada. The regulations then explain how you meet those standards and who you have to get approval from, in this case, Health Canada. Oftentimes, government regulatory bodies will create guidance documents and policies to help explain the regulations, because often they're quite confusing and convoluted. And part of our practice is interpreting and understanding those. I remember a file where I had to actually interpret the guidance document and understand it in order to understand the regulation, to advise the client on how to comply with the act. So it's a bit of a roller coaster, but part of the job. You also need to consider jurisdiction when considering regulatory issues. In Canada, we have a division of powers between the federal government and the provincial government. And in business, there's a bit of an overlap, where the federal government has jurisdiction over trade and commerce, while the provincial government has jurisdiction over property and civil rights. So you may be faced with a situation where you're regulated by both. And in fact, that happened on one file we worked on, where our client sold milk products. And of course, that's covered by the Food and Drugs Act, which is a Canadian federal statute. But the province is also regulated the sale of milk products with their own pieces of legislation. In Ontario, there was the Milk Act and the milk regulations. And so we had to consider both of those in advising the client, and the client had to consider both of those in running its business. I also mentioned municipal law at the bottom. That more has to do with building permits and zoning laws. Usually not part of my practice, but still an important factor when running a business in a particular city. Now, why should you care about regulatory issues? Well, the biggest reason in my view is costs. And for all of my clients whose businesses are regulated, they face elevated costs. And you should know about that before you get too deep into an investment or into a business opportunity. Those costs could include fees for licenses or permits. They could include fees for administrative costs or compliance costs as well. If you have a factory and you need to get it up to code, that may cost you money. You should know about that before you invest in a business. There are other issues like generating data if you need to support an application for a license or permit, and also penalties for non-compliance. But those are less difficult, but you should know about them in either case. So one way the government will regulate a particular industry is by requiring a license or a permit. And oftentimes, you need to seek approval for such a license and provide information in support of that. So you should know what your obligations are. They can regulate different areas. Sale of a good. So if you have to sell, like I mentioned before, a pharmaceutical product or a retail product, there's regulations around those, and you need to meet your obligations with those regulations. Also manufacturing. If you need to make the product, you need to know what licenses and permits you need in order to manufacture your good. And a good starting point I found was this website, canadabusiness.ca. It's actually put up by the federal government, and under their regulations and licensing section, they have a nice little search engine where you can type in your province, your city, and your area of business. So, for example, computer manufacturing, and it'll give you a nice list of potential permits that you may need. It's not a definitive guide, it's not a final word, but it's a nice preliminary reference, and it can let you know sort of what permits you might need in order to run your business. And it can be a handy tool as a starting point in case you need to get legal advice on what you need to do. You can speak more informed with your lawyer or with other people to advise you on what you need to do. And I find it as a handy tool. I ran a quick search on computer manufacturing, and it gave you a whole long list of things such as registering your business, advertising, there's permits involved with that, the sale of your products, obviously, import-export, if you're involved in importing or exporting parts for your product, you may need to deal with some regulations there. Building codes, construction, zoning, electrical and plumbing, manufacturing, even storage, there may be some permits that you may need, and you should be aware of them. So what happens if you need a license or a permit? What should you think about? What questions should you ask yourself? Well, one thing is, how strict are the requirements to get the license? That can cause problems with costs, and even more so with time. I worked on a file where the client wanted to acquire another business, and they wanted to hit the ground running as soon as they closed the deal. But unfortunately, because of how strict the requirements were for getting the license, the timing for their application for the license didn't allow them to hit the ground running. So you need to know what those requirements are and plan out your business accordingly. A good example comes from medical devices. If you're planning to sell like bandages or gauze, that's considered a Class 1 medical device. And you can apply to Health Canada for a permit. I think you can get it in 2 weeks, they told me. And not much information is needed. It's very fast. 2 weeks is lightning speed for a government agency. So, but on the other side of it, if you want to sell Class 4 medical device like a mechanical heart or one of those stents you put into a blood vessel to increase blood flow, you're going to need volumes of information to prove safety and efficacy. You're going to have to prove that your facilities are up to code, so you need approvals for not only manufacturing, but storage, packaging, labeling, all those things. And it could take a year or even more, even though you're ready to go. So you could be ready to flip the switch to start making these things, but you still may have to wait a year or more just to get regulatory approval. So it's important to know that stuff up front, rather than be surprised later on. Another thing to consider with licenses or permits are whether they're transferable. Now this comes up in the context of acquisition deals that I've worked on, where parties trying to acquire a company that sells widgets, but these widgets have a license that needs to be obtained in order to sell it. The question is, can the company I'm buying from transfer this license to me directly? If so, it can be a valuable asset. It can be something that moves very quickly, you don't have to worry, and you can hit the ground running, much like my client wanted to do in that deal I worked on. However, if it's not a direct transfer, if it's indirect, it can be a much longer process, and it can add costs and time to your business, and it can take you by surprise sometimes. And certainly for my client, that was transferability was also an issue in that case, and it turned out not so well for them. Outside of licensing and permits, what else do you have to think about? Well, in some cases, you have to report to the regulator. I know in the pharmaceutical industry, they have to give post-market reports on any adverse effects or for their drugs or anything like that. But you also got to think about inspections for your premises. How often do you have to get inspections? Do you need to meet certain codes after a certain period of time? These are things you should know early on so you can plan and understand what costs and resources you need to dedicate to your company. And a couple of final issues I'll just close with. The import-export thing that I mentioned earlier. In some cases, you do need a license. Not always, but that's something you need to know. Also, dealing with customs can be an issue, and there's some regulatory issues that I know our international trade group has dealt with a lot of these, and I've worked with them on some of those files where you have to deal with customs and determine whether you need to pay a tariff or not. And those are things you should know up front as well. Otherwise, there could be surprising costs to your business. And lastly, something that's a bit more ubiquitous that seems to come up everywhere is employment. If you have employees, there may be workplace safety issues and regulations surrounding those that you need to know about. And if you're dealing with hazardous materials, that will certainly engage a lot of different regulations in Canada. So in conclusion, I just really want you to take away the idea that you should know if you need to think about regulatory issues. You may not, it may not come up at all, but if you do need to comply with a regulation, it's better to know it up front and know what your obligations are, know what value it may add to your business or what costs it may add to your business. And I guess knowledge is power, so the earlier you know, the better. So I'll leave it open for questions.
What is good manufacturing practice?
I'm sorry?
Good manufacturing practice.
Oh, that's the standard that the government will impose on people manufacturing goods. And there's various levels of regulations that you need to meet. And it's basically a standard that they set. And you need to meet that standard in order to get approval to make a particular good. And I know it in the context more of the pharmaceutical industry where they definitely need to meet the GMP standards and need to meet it in order to get establishment licenses to make pharmaceuticals or medical devices. And it's a complicated area, but it's an area that's pretty well set in stone. Health Canada has their policies and their standards, and it's a standard that you as a manufacturer would need to meet.
Second question is, our device considered in Canada as a consumer product, while in US, medical device class 1. What strategy would be best for us to obtain license if the biggest market is US market?
Sorry, could you repeat the first part again? I didn't quite hear you.
We have a product which considered a consumer product in Canada and
Okay.
medical device class 1 in United States. So what would be the strategy for us to acquire license here in Canada and in US? How we should
Well,
approach
if it's
that?
considered a medical device in the U.S., it may well be considered a medical device here. And if it's class 1, it's probably a low threshold, and it's probably a fairly simple application process. Now, it's always on a case-by-case basis, which is always the joy of regulatory law. You never really know for sure. But if it's something like a Band-Aid or gauze or even a topical cream, oftentimes those are considered class 1, and the medical device license is all you need. You don't need an establishment license for class 1 medical devices. If it gets into class 2, then you start thinking about establishment license for manufacturing as well.
In Canada or in US?
In Canada. In US, I'm not as familiar with the regulatory regimes there as I am here. But in Canada, if it's class 1, you just need a medical device license. You don't need anything